Chapter 1. A life in the balanced crystal Lys 4 had long since slipped into obscurity, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Once, it had been a symbol of human ambition, a thriving outpost that extracted the very minerals fueling humanity's expansion into the stars. Now it was a barren wasteland, a monument to decay, abandoned as the resources ran dry and the mining giants sought greener pastures. To Lieutenant Mark Grayson, Crystal Lys 4 felt more like a sentence than an assignment. Stationed here as part of the Galactic Rescue Corps, the remote location felt like a punishment for his earlier defiance against unethical commands on a previous mission. Mark had spoken out, and his superiors had banished him to this isolated outpost. Each day seemed like an eternity, trapped in the endless, soul-crushing routine. Mark's days blended into one another as he cruised the frozen expanse in his ship, his only companions the hum of the engines and the sporadic crackling of the comms. The nights were even worse, silent, oppressive, and endless. It was during one of these monotonous patrols that everything changed. He was scanning the northern quadrant when his console suddenly beeped sharply, pulling him from his foggy stupor. Mark jerked forward, blinking at the display. Unregistered distress signal detected, the ship's AI intoned, its voice as cold as the planet's atmosphere. Mark's pulse quickened. Distress signal? He croaked, his voice rough from days of solitude. Source: approximately 7.2 kilometers north. Weak signal strength. Structural damage detected in the origin vessel. Mark's hands moved quickly over the controls, setting a course. The tedium of his existence melted away, replaced by a surge of purpose. As he neared the coordinates, the howling winds of Crystal Lys 4 battered the ship, reducing visibility to mere feet. He activated the thermal scanner, a heat signature flashing on the display. There, partially buried in the snow and ice, was the source, an alien ship, sleek and shimmering, its hull a striking blend of silver and violet that shifted like liquid metal under the light of the twin moons. Smoke curled from a gaping wound in the ship's side, and the faint hum of failing systems buzzed in Mark's ears. He guided his craft into a precarious landing a few meters from the wreck, grabbed his survival pack and weapon, and stepped out into the freezing winds. The cold seared his exposed skin, but he pushed forward, crunching through the snow toward the crash site. Inside the wreckage, chaos reigned. Broken panels, shattered glass, and the acrid smell of burnt circuitry filled the air. Mark's flashlight swept across the wreckage, landing on the lifeless body of a crew member slumped over a control console, their face obscured by a helmet. "Is anyone alive?" Mark's voice echoed through the ruin, the silence amplifying his question. A faint, labored breath reached Mark's ears. He followed the sound to the back of the ship, where he found her. She was slumped against the wall, her bioluminescent skin pulsing weakly in flashes of violet and blue. The eerie glow contrasted sharply with the dull, lifeless surroundings. Blood, darker and thicker than human blood, pooled beneath her, seeping from a deep, jagged wound in her side. Mark immediately knelt beside her, his training taking over. He activated his medkit and ran a scan of her condition. Species: Violin, the AI's voice stated. Critical condition: immediate intervention required. Mark's brow furrowed. Violin were rare and known for their technological advancements and tendency to isolate themselves from others. What was she doing here? Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his with a mixture of pain and fear. She whispered something in a language Mark couldn't understand, but the desperation in her voice was unmistakable. "Stay with me," Mark said gently but firmly. "I'm here to help." The medkit continued its diagnostic scan. Subject's physiology incompatible with standard human treatments. Blood transfusion required to stabilize. Warning: no compatible donors found. Mark clenched his jaw. "What about me?" Analyzing, the AI paused before responding. Partial compatibility detected. High risk of complications for both. Mark glanced at the woman. Her breathing was shallow, growing weaker by the second. He couldn't afford to waste time. "Do it." Proceeding with transfusion. The process was painful. The medkit extracted Mark's blood, altered it with synthetic plasma, and pumped it into the violin woman. Mark winced as more blood was taken than he'd liked, but he said nothing. He focused on her vitals, watching for any sign of improvement. Hours stretched on in heavy silence. Mark's strength began to wane, his vision blurred, but he didn't move from her side. At long last, her breathing steadied, and the weak glow of her skin strengthened. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and gratitude. She whispered again, her voice faint but melodic. The translator struggled, then produced a rough translation. "Why save me?" Mark gave a tired smile. "Because no one deserves to die alone." Her expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt a spark of purpose. Chapter 2. Bonds Beyond Blood. Mark woke to the hum of the alien ship's failing power core. floor. His body ached from the transfusion, and his head pounded with exhaustion. He lay still for a moment, replaying the events of the previous day. The alien woman, her name was Isla, he now knew from her whispered words, had survived, but at what cost? With a groan, Mark pushed himself to his feet, rubbing his eyes. He glanced toward the makeshift medical bay he'd set up inside the wrecked vessel. Isla rested on a makeshift cot crafted from salvaged materials, her bioluminescent skin faintly glowing in the dim light. The once erratic pulse of her light now beat steadily, signaling that her body was slowly stabilizing. Mark approached quietly, careful not to disturb her. As he drew closer, her eyes opened, locking onto his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice still soft but filled with curiosity, she asked, "You're human?" Mark nodded, crouching beside her. "Yeah." "Mark Grayson, Lieutenant, Galactic Rescue Corps." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You gave your blood." Mark hesitated, glancing away. "You were dying. It was the only choice." Her glowing eyes focused on him, studying him intently, before she spoke again in her native tongue. The translator hesitated, struggling with the words, then sputtered, "Why risk yourself for me?" Mark exhaled, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I couldn't just watch you die." Isla's bioluminescent pattern shifted slightly, her expression unreadable, but after a moment, she responded, her voice quieter. "Among my people, such acts are rare." Mark managed a small smile. "Where I'm from, we call it doing what's right." Over the next few days, Isla's condition steadily improved, though she was far from healed. Mark spent his time tending to her, scavenging what supplies he could from the wreckage, and sending out distress signals, hoping against hope that someone might hear them. As Isla grew stronger, she began to speak more freely. In broken English, aided by her translator, she told Mark her story. She was a researcher from the Violin capital, L. Her mission had been to study a distant star system when raiders attacked her ship. The assault had left her stranded, her crew either killed or taken. "They wanted our technology," she explained one evening, her voice heavy with sorrow. "We do not share, so they destroyed us." Mark nodded, his face hardening. He knew the type: raiders, pirates, mercenaries who preyed on weaker vessels in the more lawless regions of space. "I'm sorry about your crew," he said, his tone sincere. Isla's eyes softened. "They were my family, and now I am alone." "You're not alone," Mark replied, his voice steady. "Not anymore." Her glowing pattern shifted once more, this time brighter. Mark was beginning to understand that these changes in her light reflected her emotions. He suspected this shift might be gratitude or perhaps something deeper. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Isla began to form a fragile bond. They spent hours together, sharing stories of their worlds. Isla spoke of the crystalline cities of AIA, suspended high above the surface, bathed in the auroras that painted the night sky. "Villians value knowledge and art above all," she said, pride filling her voice. "War and conflict are foreign to us." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "You wouldn't last a week on Earth, then." "We've been at war with each other for as long as we've existed." Isla regarded him thoughtfully. "And yet, you risk your life for others. Maybe your people are not so different from mine, after all." Mark shrugged, leaning back against the wall. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just an outlier," Mark said quietly. Isla's expression softened, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to a gentle blue. "No, you are extraordinary among your kind. And mine too." Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words, though he wasn't sure how to respond. He simply nodded, offering a soft, unspoken thanks. Despite their growing bond, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. Strange symptoms began to surface. Vivid dreams of alien worlds, heightened senses that allowed him to hear even the faintest hums of the ship's failing systems, and an inexplicable pull toward Isla. He initially chalked it up to exhaustion or stress, but one morning, as he splashed cold water on his face, something caught his eye in the reflection. His normally pale skin now had a subtle iridescent glow, barely noticeable but unmistakable. His brown eyes seemed to have hints of violet swirling through them. It hit him like a blow to the stomach. Something was changing. Later, Mark sought out Isla. Something's happening to me," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "I've been having these dreams. My senses are sharper, and my eyes." He gestured toward his face, unable to finish the sentence. Isla's gaze fell, her bioluminescent patterns dimming in response. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice yet." Mark's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated before answering in a low voice. "When you gave your blood to save me, it triggered a reaction. Your body is adapting. It now carries traces of violent DNA." Mark's mind raced as he processed her words. "Adapting? Does that mean I'm becoming like you?" "No," she replied quickly, shaking her head. "You're still human, but your DNA has integrated elements of mine. That's why you're having the dreams, why your senses are heightened. Your body is changing. Mark clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. And you didn't think I needed to know this? I didn't want to burden you, Isla said, her voice trembling. You've already sacrificed so much. I thought I could find a way to fix it before it became noticeable. Mark exhaled deeply, his anger fading into a weary resignation. So what now? Before Isla could answer, the ship's alarm blared to life. Mark's stomach dropped as proximity sensors confirmed his fears. 3 heavily armed ships were heading straight for them. They've found us, Isla whispered, her face drained of color. Mark grabbed his rifle, his movements sharp. Stay here, I'll take care of it. Mark, you can't. Just trust me, he said, his voice steady and resolute. He stepped out into the harsh wind, his mind focused on one thing, protecting Isla, no matter what it cost. Chapter 3. The hidden cost. The alarm blared through the battered alien ship, its shrill wail cutting through the frozen silence of Crystal Lease 4. Mark's eyes snapped to the console, his grip tightening on the rifle slung over his shoulder. The proximity scanners confirmed his worst fears. 3 heavily armed ships were on their way. Isla stood at the central control station, her bioluminescent patterns flickering wildly, reflecting the turmoil inside her. Her hands flew over the console, amplifying the distress signal as she desperately tried to make contact. Her eyes, glowing with urgency, turned to Mark, filled with fear. Mark, they're here, she said, her voice tight with panic. They're here, she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Mark nodded grimly, his expression hardening. He'd known this day was coming ever since Isla told him about the raiders who had slaughtered her crew for their advanced technology. It was only a matter of time before they returned to finish what they started. How much time do we have? He asked, his tone calm but firm. Minutes, she replied quickly. Kor is with them. Mark's jaw clenched at the name. He knew who Kor was. Every soldier in the outer systems had heard of him. A living nightmare, a ruthless warlord whose reputation for cruelty and precision was matched only by his relentless pursuit of his targets. Kor was the type of man who left nothing alive if it suited him. We'll make it work, Mark said, unslinging his rifle and checking the charge. His movements were deliberate, his face a mask of calm despite the rising tension inside him. You can't fight them alone, Isla said, stepping toward him, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with urgency. They'll kill you. Mark gave her a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Then I'll make sure it costs them. You don't understand, she pressed, her voice rising with desperation. Kor doesn't just kill. He breaks people. He'll ruin you. Mark met her gaze, his eyes steady. Not if I destroy him first. Isla's patterns dimmed, her version of a frown. She hesitated, clearly torn, before speaking in a softer tone. Mark, your body, it's changing. You've felt it, haven't you? The strength, the speed, it's not normal. I don't know how far it will go, but if you push yourself too far, I'll be fine, he interrupted, his voice firm. Stay inside. Seal the ship. Keep the beacon active. Someone will pick it up. Isla bit her lip, her glow flickering with uncertainty. After a long pause, she nodded. Be careful. Mark gave her a reassuring nod before stepping outside into the biting cold. The wind stung his face as he moved toward the rocky outcropping near the ship, using it as cover. The distant sound of the raider ship's engines grew louder, their thrusters glowing faintly through the blizzard. The raiders' ships landed with a deafening roar, their black hulls sleek and menacing, bristling with weaponry. Snow and ice were kicked up violently as their engines roared to a stop, and the hatches hissed open one by one. The raiders emerged, armored in scavenged gear, each one carrying a weapon, plasma rifles, blades, and homemade explosives. Kor appeared last, towering over the rest of the group. His black armor, equipped with a plasma axe, hummed with deadly energy. The insignia of a snarling wolf on his helmet made him look less human and more like a beast. Kor's voice boomed across the barren landscape, amplified by the speakers in his armor. Then, I know you're hiding in there. Come out now and I'll make your death quick. Resist, and I'll make you scream for mercy. Mark stepped out from behind the rocks, his rifle raised and steady. I'm not going anywhere, he called, his voice unwavering despite the overwhelming odds. The raiders immediately aimed their weapons at him, but Mark stood firm, refusing to flinch. Kaler tilted his head, eyeing Mark with a cold, calculating gaze. And who are you, little soldier? He sneered. A protector? Or just another fool who thinks he can stop me? Mark's lips curled into a smirk, his finger hovering over the trigger. Why don't you come and find out? Kaler let out a low, menacing laugh. Kill him. The raiders surged forward, their boots crunching through the snow as they charged at Mark. He waited until they were close enough, then fired. His enhanced reflexes guided his shots, each plasma bolt striking with pinpoint accuracy. 2 raiders fell, fell, disarmed and disabled in the blink of an eye. The third came at him with a blade, but Mark sidestepped effortlessly, driving the butt of his rifle into the attacker's ribs. The raider collapsed, gasping for breath. Mark spun to face the next threat, his movements swift and precise. Inside the ship, Isla watched through the viewport, her bioluminescent patterns flickering wildly. She had seen warriors before, but Mark was different. His speed, his accuracy. It was as if his body was reacting faster than his mind could process, instinct guiding him in ways she had never witnessed. Kaler, observing the fight with an amused smirk, chuckled darkly. Interesting, he muttered. Let's see how long you can keep this up. He gestured to his elite guard, 4 raiders, all heavily armed and moving with the deadly precision of battle-hardened soldiers. They advanced toward Mark, weapons aimed and ready. Mark clenched his teeth. His body was already starting to protest, the strain of the fight taking its toll. The changes in his physiology had given him an edge, but it was becoming harder to ignore the exhaustion creeping in. Taking a deep breath, he braced himself as the elite guard closed in. The battle intensified. The elite raiders attacked in perfect sync, their strikes overwhelming Mark, forcing him to defend himself. He dodged and parried as best as he could, using the rocky terrain to create space and distance. Chapter 4. A new beginning. Mark's body was on fire with pain. Every muscle screamed in protest, and his lungs burned from the exertion, the frigid air of crystal lease for making each breath feel like a struggle. But nothing compared to the relief that washed over him when he heard the sound of the raider ships retreating into the sky. Opening his eyes, Mark found himself lying inside the alien vessel, the faint hum of its deteriorating systems providing a familiar, if eerie, background. Isla knelt beside him, her bioluminescent patterns soft but steady. She had covered him with a thermal blanket, and her hands hovered over a medical console, which beeped as it scanned his injuries. "You're awake," she said, her voice a mix of relief and concern. Mark managed a weak grin. "That's up for debate." Isla didn't smile. Instead, she regarded him with a serious expression that made him uneasy, her glowing patterns dimming, her version of a frown. "You're not fine, Mark. Whatever this transformation is, it's accelerating. The fight pushed you too far." Mark propped himself up on one elbow, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. "I didn't have much choice. They weren't exactly going to just leave us alone." Isla's patterns dimmed further, and she looked away for a moment, as though struggling with her thoughts. "You shouldn't have had to fight them alone." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," Isla said softly. Mark looked at her, his exhaustion weighing heavily on his words. "For what? You didn't bring those raiders here, did you?" "No," she confessed, her voice trembling. "But I brought you into this, and now..." She gestured to the holographic display floating in front of them, showing a live readout of his vitals. His DNA was displayed as a twisting double helix, but certain sections shimmered with faint violet strands, markers of the Violin integration. "Your body is changing because of me," she said quietly. Mark's eyes fixed on the display, the gravity of the situation slowly sinking in. "What does that mean?" he asked after a long pause. Isla hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know. Your body's adapting in ways I've never seen. You're stronger, faster, but these changes aren't meant to last. If this keeps going, your body may not survive." The silence in the room was only broken by the faint hum of the ship's failing systems. Mark leaned back against the wall, his eyes closing as the memories of the fight surged through him, his heightened reflexes, his body moving as if controlled by instinct. It had been both thrilling and terrifying. "How long do I have?" he asked, his voice quiet but urgent. "I can't say," Isla replied, her tone thick with concern. "Days, maybe weeks, but there's a chance. If we make it to my homeworld, Vea, the researchers there might be able to stabilize your condition." Mark opened his eyes and met her gaze. "Then let's not waste any more time." It took 2 more days to reach Vea. The raider attack had left the ship in worse shape than they'd anticipated, and Isla worked tirelessly to repair what she could. Mark helped when he could, but his body refused to recover quickly from the toll of the battle. He felt the changes in him even more now, his senses sharper, his strength returning far too quickly for comfort. Yet with every surge of power, a deep, gnawing fatigue followed, draining him in ways he couldn't ignore. One evening, as he struggled to lift a heavy power cell into place, Isla noticed and stepped over to him. "You shouldn't be pushing yourself like this," she said softly. "I'm fine," Mark replied, though his shaking hands betrayed him. "No, you're not," she said, taking the power cell from his hands hands with gentle ease. Her touch was warm, and Mark felt it in the depths of his bones. "Please, let me handle it. You've done enough." Mark stepped back, leaning against the wall. "I'm not good at sitting still." Isla gave him a soft smile, her bioluminescent patterns calming. "Then consider this your lesson in patience. It took everything they had, scavenging the wreckage, to get the ship operational. It wasn't close to its original condition, but it was enough to get them off Crystal Lease 4 and heading toward Vea." As the ship broke through the atmosphere, Mark stared out the viewport, watching the icy world fade into the emptiness of space. Isla stood beside him, her expression unreadable, as usual. "Do you think they'll accept me?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Isla turned to him, her glowing eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. "They won't have a choice. You saved me. That will mean more to them than you realize." Mark's brow furrowed. "And what if they don't care?" Isla's pattern shifted, glowing brighter for a moment, before she answered. "Then we'll deal with that when we get there. Then I'll make them care." Arrival at Vea. The journey to Vea spanned 3 standard days, and during that time, Mark and Isla grew closer. They exchanged stories of their homeworlds, their cultures, and the lives they had left behind. For Mark, it was a chance to reconnect with a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. For Isla, it allowed her to see humanity through his eyes, its flaws, its resilience, and its capacity for compassion. When they finally arrived, Vea took Mark's breath away. The planet was an awe-inspiring spectacle, bathed in vibrant light and color. Its atmosphere shimmered with glowing auroras, dancing gracefully across the sky. Towering crystalline cities hovered above the planet's surface, their shining bridges of energy connecting them like veins of light. The sight was nothing like anything Mark had ever seen, alien yet profoundly beautiful. The ship landed on a platform high above the capital city of Lys. As they stepped into the bustling streets, Mark felt the weight of many eyes on him. Villians, their expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness, stared at the human among them, but none dared approach. At the heart of the city stood the council hall, a massive structure made entirely of translucent crystal. Inside, Isla introduced Mark to the Council of Elders, a group of dignified Villians whose glowing patterns shifted in unison as they deliberated. "You bring a human to Vea?" one elder inquired, his voice measured but curious. "Why? He saved my life," Isla responded, her tone steady. "In doing so, his body began to change. He needs our help." The council exchanged uncertain glances, their patterns flickering with doubt. "A human adapting to violent physiology? This has never happened before. It is also irreversible," Isla continued. "If we do nothing, he will die." The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of her words settled in. Mark stood quietly beside her, his gaze unwavering despite the scrutiny. After a tense pause, one of the elders spoke again. "We will do what we can." The price of survival. The days that followed were a blur of tests, scans, and treatments. Violent scientists worked tirelessly, their curiosity about Mark's condition tempered by the urgency of his need for help. Isla never left his side, offering a constant source of comfort amidst the chaos. The treatments were intense, pushing Mark's body to its limits as the scientists worked to stabilize his altered DNA. At times, the pain was excruciating, but he endured it quietly, not wanting to show weakness. Isla's presence was his anchor, her hand in his offering more strength than any medication could. "You're stronger than I thought," she said one evening as they sat together in the medical bay. Mark let out a weak chuckle. "I've had a lot of reasons to be strong." Her glowing patterns shifted gently, a faint blush coloring her features. "You've done more for me than anyone has. I won't let you face this alone." A new legacy. After weeks of rigorous treatments, the scientists finally succeeded in stabilizing Mark's condition. His body was no longer fighting against itself. Though the changes remained, he was now stronger, faster, and more attuned to the world around him than any human had ever been. But more than that, Mark felt a deep connection to Isla, to Vea, and to something far larger than himself. As he stood on a balcony overlooking the glittering city, Isla joined him, her bioluminescent patterns glowing softly, casting gentle ripples of light. "You've become a part of us," she said, awe evident in her voice. "And you've become a part of me," Mark replied, turning to meet her gaze. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had experienced settling between them. Then, Isla reached out, her hand brushing against his. "This isn't the end of your journey, Mark," she said quietly. "It's the beginning of ours." Mark smiled, his grip tightening around hers. Together, they looked out at the shimmering city, the aurora painting the sky in brilliant hues, a promise of hope and a future neither of them could have ever imagined.